Janice Campbell, take one.
I am Janice Campbell, and I homeschooled from the late 80s until my boys were done, which was a different journey for us because they went into early college, and so it wasn't really the whole 12-year spectrum, but I had 4 boys and within about a 7-year span. So they played together, they learned together, we did tons of reading together, and that formed the backbone of our homeschooling. And then I started speaking and writing in the homeschooling community in the late 80s. Like the second homeschool conference I'd ever gone to, they asked me to speak on how to teach writing because that was my topic, and I did the homeschool newsletter for our state group. Well, started out with our local, then our regional, then our state, and so started being asked to speak on that, and then later on how to create transcripts and do high school. And so I've been speaking forever on the topic, and I just enjoy seeing families working together to educate their children in a way that fits the child.
What led you to homeschooling your children?
I started thinking about homeschooling when my oldest son was about 2 or 3. I realized that I had a gifted child on my hands. He enjoyed discussing theology at a deep rate. He was deeply absorbed in whatever topic he was studying. He started out, being interested in Indians and just learning all he could, and then he went into classical music, all of those things. And the nice thing about that was because I was with him and could observe him, I could feed him materials, we could go to the library and fill up his well. And I knew that when he got to school in a structure where they had to keep a schedule, and they had 29 other little children who all had differing interests or abilities, he would be lost. And so I started thinking, I'm going to have to learn about homeschooling. And there were people in our church who had homeschooled, but they were doing it in a way that didn't appeal to me at all. Just following a curriculum that replicated the public school curriculum. And that just was not going to be a fit for my son at all, or for me either, because it hadn't fit me when I was in school. And so I started the journey at that point when he was 2 or 3, and my other sons came along, and by the time he was 4, he was starting to learn, things that he would have learned in elementary school, and we were having so much fun. I just never looked back.
Okay, so you talked about how you didn't relate very well with the others that were in your church because they were doing it the way traditional school was. What was different about the way that you decided to homeschool? Tell me about that.
What I had noticed when I was growing up was that I learned best through reading and through doing. And if I wanted to know something, I would go to the library. I learned never to ask a person. They would give you a shallow answer, usually kind of to get rid of the little kid asking pesky questions. If you're familiar with that, if you were a question asker as a child, it probably happened to you too. But I was a kid who wanted to know. And I had kids who wanted to know. I had actually 4 very curious children, and I'm pretty sure that all children start out being very curious until it's squashed with tedious and boring and unrelated things. So by remembering the way I learned, I just started proceeding mostly on instinct. I always stuck with a textbook for math because math was my weaker subject. I was not engaged in numbers. They didn't appeal to me as words did, but I loved the dance of words, the artistry of it, the craft of it, and I loved to play with words. And so I did it with my boys. We'd talk answers, we'd sing answers, but I learned that observing my children, finding out how they learned best. My oldest son learned best by hearing. So I ended up getting him audio resources, video resources from the teaching company, which is college courses taught by amazing professors. He started loving those when he was very young and would listen over and over, and then he could narrate back the basic, well, more than the basics. He could narrate almost the whole thing back to me after 1 or 2 listenings. And so I read the book For the Children's Sake very, very early on, right after it was published. And I also read Mary Pride's Big Book of Home Learning right after it was published. And those two things together, Mary Pride's book introduced me to a wide spectrum of materials I had not otherwise heard of. Then I found Kathy Duffy's curriculum guides with all the curriculum reviews, and she introduced me to learning styles and another array of curriculum. And so I read every word of every description in those books. And then when I found For the Children's Sake, it gave me a way of putting together some of what I was reading, the different ways that children learn and different ways that teaching is presented in the different curriculums. The Charlotte Mason method is outlined in For the Children's Sake, and that's more of it's not really a how-to guide. It's more of a memoir, how this works in real life, of the Macaulay's experience. And seeing that work, I realized that I could take the way I learned best through books, and in my son's case, through audiobooks, and apply Charlotte Mason's methods of working with narration and dictation, copy work, recitation, memorization, all of those things. Those were traditional tools that had been used since essentially the dawn of education. Children were scratching letters in the sand on a slate or a papyrus, or all sorts of ways. There's always been copy work. That's how you learn. And artists learn by copying the great masters and seeing how they created their effects. And so once I had focused on that, I realized that we could proceed working with my children in the way that they learned best. I didn't have to follow someone else's curriculum, and it was just like an open door. There was a lot of freedom to it. One of Charlotte Mason's basic tenets is short lessons with very focused attention will get you better results than long, tedious, diluted lessons. And also the other thing about it is that the teacher doesn't need to talk a lot. Let the child interface with great minds in great books. That's an essential thing. I found that my kids could listen to an audiobook. I remember when my oldest two were like 4 and 6, and they were listening to Moby Dick, the unabridged Moby Dick on audio. And, I knew that they were not getting it at the level of a college student or a high school student. Pretty much now, no one gets it at the level that probably the original audience did. But I realized they were really getting it when I looked out my kitchen window one day and I saw the 4-year-old lying on the grass and the 6-year-old standing on the picnic table with a long stick, getting ready to harpoon him, shouting, "There she blows," because the 4-year-old was obviously Moby Dick, the white whale. And so they were reenacting the story in their spare time, having fun, but they were getting the plot. And to this day, there's metaphors from Moby Dick that pop up in conversation from time to time. So literature is the foundation for everything for us.
Can you go a little bit deeper into Charlotte Mason then, since you've already started down that road, and talk a little bit more about what the Charlotte Mason method is?
Charlotte Mason, she was a 19th century British educator who saw that the children in her environment needed education. At that time, a classical education was only available to the upper classes. You had tutors, and the classics were thought to be accessible only to those who had been bred into that class. But Charlotte Mason thought a little differently. She believed that all children could appreciate Shakespeare and Beowulf and the Odyssey and all of the great classics. And she also believed that was the best way to learn. She must have grown up reading books. And so she had been classically educated. And so she started seeking ways. She went through school. She didn't come from a very privileged background, but privileged enough so that she had received a good education and she knew what it was. And so she started experimenting in her own little school, Ambleside, and created ways of teaching. So children would interact with great literature. She said at one point that they would read 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000 words per year in a set number of great books. But some of those great books, like Plutarch's Lives, the plays of Shakespeare, and so forth, those would take them years to cover because they would cover short lessons, they would cover it deeply and in depth, and they would also use things like copywork, which is simply copying the text as you see it. And the reason that copywork resonated so much with me when I first heard of it, I realized that a lot of people think just copying, you don't learn, you're just copying, you don't learn that much. But I had worked as a calligrapher for many years and taught calligraphy. And so one of the big things with calligraphy, you are very often transcribing text for people. They want a poem copied. And I found that after I had copied anything, at least once, I retained almost all of it in its entirety, and whole phrases and, ways of using language would stick with me in a way that it just doesn't when you just read it. And so it was a way of getting content into your head. I learned in college. I taught myself in college to use a form of copywork because I was already doing the calligraphy thing. So I learned that if I copied things from history, segments of, say, a general's journal or the story of a scientific discovery, I would retain it. And it wouldn't be cramming for the final. It would actually be remembering and understanding it and internalizing it. It works best with source documents, living books. Living books is something that Charlotte Mason mentioned. Don't use twaddle, as she said, but use books that have intrinsic worth and value. They've stood the test of time. They're the books that contain live ideas. Like when you buy a container of yogurt and it'll say on the side, contains live cultures. Well, a living book contains live ideas. Those ideas that will spring to the mind from the author who is well-versed in his subject, a master at expressing it. Those ideas will spring directly to the mind of the student and stick. Whereas if the teacher interfaces and dilutes it by a lot of talk and tries to explain it, those ideas tend to get diluted, and a lot of times they die in transmission. And so Charlotte Mason's focus, living books, great ideas, mind to mind, all of those things, they worked perfectly for boys, especially because boys worked well with the short attention spans in some cases. My gifted son especially would have a very long attention span with things he enjoyed. He would listen, for example, to a teaching company course. The first one he got was how to listen to and understand great music. He requested it for his birthday, which was sort of odd. At that time, it had 80 hours of college lectures, and he disappeared into his room and listened to it straight through, just coming up for meals and sleeping and narrating bits of it to us as, he came up for those things. And then he turned back around and listened to it straight through again. So his attention span was incredible. The others had very long attention spans for what suited them, except for our kinesthetic learner whose attention span was shorter but deep when it lasted. So being able to work with principles from Charlotte Mason that fit my kids was huge. And I've seen them work with other types of children, other types of attention spans. We talk about people with attention deficit disorder a lot now. And I realize that a lot of that is affected by screen time. The more screen time a student has, the shorter their attention span usually is, because it does change the actual structure of your brain. There's neural plasticity and things like that, but I'm not the expert on that. But it's something to consider in a home where, especially where you're homeschooling, less screen time is almost always better. I cannot think of any circumstances in which that would not be the case. So seeking to go deeper into living books and great ideas is the goal. Living books, I like to say, you have the list of the classics. My Excellence in Literature book list is the classics that I would recommend that students start with, but they don't get there until 8th grade to high school, some younger. But Shakespeare, of course, is on every living book list. But a living book is a book that will send an idea to a child. And those books tend to be well written, by authors who are experts in their subjects. A lot of landmark biographies, for example, are living books. They are not regarded today by a lot of modern people as a perfect biography, more as creative nonfiction, simply because dialogue has been created in them. But that makes them more interesting. It makes them actually more of a living book. It creates a rapport between the student and the historic figure that causes the student to recall that figure and relate to that figure. So I also will say about a living book that sometimes a book will be a living book for me, and it may not be a living book for someone from an entirely different background and experience. And sometimes a book is a living book for you at a particular time in your life because it meets you at a particular place. There are books that are living books for me because of where I come from. I come from Southern California, and California history is a big deal, and the particular area where I came from had particular issues. And I found a book recently and read it, and it was an absolutely living book for me. I don't know if it's lasting literature for anyone else. It was a bestseller. But for me, it took place about 3 miles from where I grew up. And I recognized my people, my places, and the work of God in those lives. And so it really brought together a lot of ideas for me. But overall, you will find lists of great living books. I have lists on my Excellence in Literature website called, I have a list of historical fiction that is living books, a list of books that boys like, which isn't always a list of books that everybody likes, but usually everybody will like the boys' books because they tend to have more going on. But otherwise, living books, Shakespeare, Plutarch, the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, the books that tell the stories of Western civilization, our culture, how we came to be, all of the things that tell of people doing amazing, remarkable things for good reasons. I tend to come at things from a faith-based perspective, and so I love seeing why people did things. The foundational reasons. A lot of times diaries and journals are living books. Source documents are huge. I mean, I consider the Declaration of Independence to be a living document and well worth studying and memorizing. Same with the Constitution. Those are living documents because they affect our lives, and they are packed from top to bottom, beginning to end. Living books don't have to be fiction. They can just inspire. And of course, the Bible is definitely a living book. I tend to suggest that everyone should read a little bit of the King James, even if your church or whatever reads a different translation. All students should read the King James through at least once, for the reason that the phraseology, quotations, and allusions from that specific translation are throughout British literature and American literature from the time of the King James on. And also the King James is the language of Shakespeare. And if you read the King James Bible through at least once, you will understand Shakespeare much better. One of my college professors, the one that was in charge of the senior seminar for English majors, said at one point, I can always tell who was raised on the King James Bible because their vocabulary is much larger. Their library of allusions is endless, and they simply express themselves differently. And so that's something to know. That's really a worthwhile pursuit. So, King James.
Interesting. That is I've never ever thought about that before. That's so interesting.
Right, because I don't read it now for just my regular Bible reading, but
right.
Just having gone through it, I was first few years of life was raised on it.
Awesome. I want to go back in a few minutes to your business, but first I want to talk. You had mentioned earlier learning styles, and I don't know how well versed you are in that, but I would love for you to talk about the different learning styles and maybe even give some examples of your boys and their different learning styles and touch on
yes. Learning styles were such a revelation to me because I knew how I learned. And I was already observing that my oldest son learned very, very differently. He wanted audio stuff all the time, but the brother that was 2 years behind him learned very differently from him. He learned like I did. He wanted to read, and he got really, really annoyed with audio stuff. He didn't want to be read to because he could read much faster on his own, and he could cover more ground. He could retain more. And that was the key thing for me. The point of reading is retention. You want them to absorb, and you want them to get the story, you want them to enjoy it. And so I learned that reading aloud is a fabulous activity. It's a great family thing, but not for whole books for some students. And so studying learning styles, I discovered that there's 3 essential ways that we take in information. There's the auditory through our ears, visual through our eyes, and kinesthetic through doing. My 3rd son surprised me. He didn't seem to enjoy reading. In fact, he was almost 10 before he was reading fluently. And he didn't seem like he was paying attention when we read aloud, but then he could tell us back, he could narrate, and he conversed with the other boys, could retain stuff, his vocabulary was growing, but there was this whole challenge with reading to him or having him around or having him learn. He couldn't sit still, and he was all over everywhere and always doing things, and he was my one who was most adept with his hands. And so I realized he's a kinesthetic learner. He learns by doing. And then I realized, look at my husband and see how he learns as well. Our 4th son, kind of a blend. He's a kind of an auditory visual person with a leaning toward visual. So what I've just discovered that you have to work with that. But there's not just learning styles. There's not just the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic styles. There's different ways of being smart, multiple intelligences, Gardner's multiple intelligences. And so you can be nature smart, word smart, body smart, which is, the kinesthetic person tends to be very movement capable, very capable of controlling their body, and fine motor skills develop quickly and so forth. They're the people who don't have accidents. And people who are word smart tend to be your writers. People who are number smart tend to be the logical, linear people, and so forth. Anyway, there's 8 different intelligences. And then you have another way of thinking about your children. Do they come from more of a right-brained or a left-brain perspective? If you look at any diagram of right brain, left brain, you see that your left brain is more analytical and thinks more linearly. Well, it needs to be taught in a more linear way. And any of your learning styles, your auditory, visual, or kinesthetic, can be left brain or right brained, although, there's tendencies. And so you start noticing all these variations in your kids. And your right brain person is, likely to be creative and visual and doing all the artsy, craftsy stuff and drawing little doodles in their textbooks and so forth. And it is an interesting thing to think about being a homeschooling teacher when you have a whole house full of kids that are different in so many different ways. But you think about it, in a classroom, they're all taught the same way and run through the same materials and have the same explanations, and it's a challenge to learn. So for kids like me who learn by seeing, the visual people, regular schoolwork's great. Read the textbook, answer the questions at the end, you can do that. For the auditory kid, if the teacher doesn't give a good lecture or let them listen to the book on audio, they're missing half of it. I always think of those learning styles as a God-given learning gate. So you can drive a truck full of knowledge through there and it all goes through. Otherwise, you're standing outside the wall, tossing bits of knowledge over a fence, it has an open gate, but you're tossing bits of knowledge over the fence, and some of it gets through and some of it doesn't. And so I just think it pays to work with the learning styles. You are always trying to develop the learning styles that they don't have and encourage them to learn with head, heart, and hand. That's one thing I always tried to focus on, presenting information with head, heart, and hand. You know, the facts through the mind, the logos, and then you have the heart. The story is what sticks. The ideas usually stick through by the means of story. Charlotte Mason always said, no knowledge really sticks unless there's a story to hook it to. And that's one reason that my slightly less scientific boys, I had a couple that were very sciencey and then a couple that were not really. And the stuff that stuck was the stories of how scientists discovered. So I found living books that described scientific discoveries. And so that fits the living books. You can find living books that fit every learning style. With an auditory child, you would take that living book and present it via audiobook or reading aloud. We read aloud a lot. We spent a whole lot of time on the sofa because all of your students, no matter what learning style, benefit from being read to or reading it themselves, in the case of the one who really could hardly bear to be read to. But what you find is that reading aloud, it works differently for each learning style, and it's one way of discerning what learning style your child is. So as you're reading aloud and you have your kids on the sofa, there's going to be the kid who wants to sit right next to you and see the words in the pictures and has to see the book. And then you're going to have the kid who's content to sit on the corner of the sofa or whatever, gaze off into space and not even look at the pictures, not even look at anything, but remembers basically everything from the book. That's your auditory kid. The kid who has to see it is obviously your visual kid. And the kid who's climbing over the back of the sofa, wiggling around you, driving you absolutely nuts and making his brothers really mad is the kinesthetic kid. And you let the kinesthetic kid go sit behind the sofa with some Legos. And he, as long as he sits there quietly and builds stuff and does things with his Legos, he hears and he retains. It seems like having something to do with his hands helps keep the wiggly part of him from going nuts. And so his mind can focus on what's being read. So you just learn to work with each of those learning styles.